The Farmer's Bride is a poem written by Charlotte Mew in the early 1900s that tells the story of a farmer, in this case the speaker, who marries a woman or a girl who he believes to have been too young and who refuses to love him and essentially give him what he wants, which is sex and ultimately a child. During the poem she runs away and he catches her, takes her back to the farm, and the poem ends with her being locked in the attic and with their relationship really being at a kind of stalemate point where neither of them are communicating at all. The poem is written in the form of a dramatic monologue, and it's a poem that really easily compares to Porphyria's Lover, and I think contrasts very, very nicely with the poem Sing Song, which are also on the AQA Love and Relationships cluster. So I'm going to do a video in which I compare and contrast those for you so you can have a proper look at them. But in the meantime, we're going to take a look at this poem on its own. I'm going to talk you through the poem line by line so that you understand it. I'm going to pull out some of the language features, look at the structure, and look at some of the themes. And I'm going to give you a little table as well to help you kind of revise the poem and really get your head around it. So make sure you've got a copy of the poem in front of you. Grab yourself a pen and a blank piece of paper. Let's get on with it. Okay, before we actually start analysing the poem, I just want to talk a little bit about the context of the poem. It's one of the poems in the anthology that's written by a female, and I think the woman in The Farmer's Bride, or the girl in The Farmer's Bride, is somebody who the reader automatically sort of sympathises with. She's painted in a very, very sympathetic light. She's a victim, essentially. This poem was written at a time when women's rights were on the agenda. It's a funny sort of time because women didn't have many rights, and certainly in a marriage a woman wouldn't have had many rights compared to what a woman would have today, which would essentially be equal rights. But it was written at a time, despite women not having many rights, it was written at a time when women's rights were very much on the agenda. This poem was published in 1916. In 1918, 2 years later, women were given the vote. So this is a poem that was written really at that kind of time when women's rights were sort of coming to the fore and sort of becoming more and more of an issue. So it's just worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about the context of this poem. Okay, we're going to start off just taking a look at the title. This is a poem, like I said, that compares very well to Porphyria's Lover because there's a real element of control in the poem and ownership in the poem. Looking at the title, The Farmer's Bride, we've instantly got the farmer, the speaker, having ownership of the woman, as denoted by the possessive apostrophe. But what's interesting about this poem is that she is referred to as his bride in the title. Let's think about that for a minute. A bride is a woman who has just married a man. You're not a bride for very long, okay? Before you marry somebody, you are his girlfriend. When you've married him, you are his wife. For maybe one night, you are the bride. The bride is actually, it's that window between marrying a man and consummating a marriage. I'm going to be kind of frank with you for those of you who don't know what consummating a marriage means. Consummating a marriage is when you have sex. So you get married and then the marriage has to be consummated. We've got this reference to the bride in the title which suggests straight away that this is a marriage that has not been consummated. So already there's that hint that something's wrong in this relationship. This isn't a sexual relationship. This isn't a relationship of passion. This isn't going to be a love poem. Looking at the opening line of the poem, we've got this line, 3 summers since I chose a maid. So we learn that the events in the poem go back a long way. This happened, this marriage happened 3 years ago. So to come back to the title, the fact that she's still his bride means that in the 3 years that he's been married to her, he hasn't had sex with her. So that tells you straight away that there's something seriously wrong in this couple's relationship. He refers to her as a maid, and that's what she would have been before she was the bride, the single woman, essentially. But this is interesting as well. I chose a maid. You know, this idea that he just chose her He just kind of he looked around almost and went, well, let's have a look. Oh, that one's all right. I'll have that one. Almost like he was picking out a shirt or picking out a pair of shoes from a shop. Again, we've got that sense of ownership in the poem, like she belongs to him. So we've got the possessive apostrophe in the title. We've got the idea of him choosing her. In the second line, we start to learn a little bit about perhaps what might be wrong with the marriage. The farmer puts it down to the fact that she was probably too young. This suggests that she was perhaps kind of not quite a woman yet. So he suggests that she's too young, and then he says, but at the time, I was busy. I was harvesting the crops, so there was more stuff to do than to take my time and woo her. To woo kind of means to take a woman out, to make her fall in love with you, and he didn't have time to do that. He didn't have time to do anything. You kind of bide your time when you take your time. He didn't have time. He was very busy. He was harvesting, and he's a farmer, so that's what he does. But it kind of suggests that he really kind of just went into this marriage without really thinking it through. He didn't get to know her. It suggests that the marriage was arranged to an extent as well. They didn't meet, they didn't fall in love, they didn't really talk or communicate. He just kind of went, oh, I'll have that one, she'll do. And he just, she's pretty, she'll do. And he just took her, and he expected her to behave like a wife should behave, because a man essentially at this period had a lot of power over a woman when he was married to her. And then he says, when us was wed, she turned afraid of love and me, and all things human. So what essentially he's saying there is that as soon as they got married, he realised that she was afraid of him and afraid of love. And I would suggest that this happened probably the night that they got married, and he tried to have sex with her. Yeah, you've got this idea that he tried to consummate the marriage and she wouldn't have it. Essentially, she said, no, I don't love you, I'm not going to do that with you. And the fact that she was afraid kind of suggests that perhaps he was quite pushy with her. He says she was afraid of love, and then he says she was afraid of all things human, which perhaps links to later on in the poem when she becomes uncommunicative and withdrawn, and we get this imagery of her with the animals. And then he says, like the shut of a winter's day, her smile went out, and she wasn't a woman, more like a frightened fae. I just want to take a look at that because we've got a simile going on there. The idea of winter in a poem often symbolises the end of something. It often symbolises sort of barrenness, coldness in this case, starkness. She's not giving him anything, she's cold with him, and that simile, comparing her to the end of a winter's day, kind of suggests that this was a relationship that was almost dead before it even started. It was dead before it even got off the ground. We've also got this line, she wasn't a woman, which I think if you read it literally as he intends, what he's saying there is, she didn't behave like a woman should, i.e. she wasn't the loving wife that I had expected. But I also think we can refer back to this line, she was too young. You know what? She probably wasn't a woman. She was probably a girl or an adolescent. She was probably on that line between adolescence and womanhood. And there's evidence of that, I think, when we look at the idea of harvest time and the symbolism of harvest time. Harvest time is when fruit ripens, when you pick the fruit. Harvest time is the time when fruit is just ripe enough for picking. So if we think about this woman and we think about this symbolically, there may be that suggestion of her being perhaps just a woman, but not really a woman. She's on that borderline, and he's picked her at a time when she's just not ready to marry, she's not ready to have sex. Do you know what I mean? She's not at that stage, and she didn't choose him anyway, he chose her. So even if she was ready, she doesn't love him. And then he compares her to a frightened fae, and fae means fairy, so he compares her to a frightened little fairy. So already we're starting to get the picture of this bride as somebody who's weak, vulnerable, has really no choice in the matter. She's owned, she's scared, and you know, she's cold towards him, understandably. And then we've got the line, one night in the fall, she runned away. The fall is the autumn. And if we look at harvest time, you know, harvest time I suppose is like the end of the summer, the fall being the autumn. It didn't take her very long to run away. Do you know what I mean? This wasn't something that she really had to think very hard about. This was I would almost say, I wouldn't even call it an arranged marriage. I would suggest it was a forced marriage. You'll notice that we've got some phonetic language in this poem. She twant a woman, she runned away. The farmer is a rural, he's a rural guy. He's a guy from a very rural community. He's not particularly educated, and that reflects in his language. I think this guy is somebody who is unintelligent. He's academically unintelligent, and he's emotionally unintelligent. In this poem, there's really absolutely no understanding of his wife and how she feels. There's no sympathy for her. There's no real attempt to get to know her. He's really just confused about the fact that she doesn't want to sleep with him. She doesn't want to give him children. So the farmer in the poem, the speaker in the poem, lacks that emotional intelligence. I just want to comment a little bit on the form as well. The form of the poem in general. It's a dramatic monologue, as I might have said at the beginning. Dramatic monologue when we get one person's point of view. So we get the story from one person's perspective. In this case, the story is from the perspective of the farmer. And that kind of almost suggests control as well. The fact that she doesn't have a voice in the poem. She's denied a voice in the poem. However, that being said, there's a hell of a lot about her that we find out in the poem, and I think if you start to read between the lines, and sometimes you don't even have to read between the lines, the picture that he paints of her is very sympathetic. As a modern day reader, certainly we can sympathise with her. At the end of the first stanza, we've got this line about how she runs away one night, and that's continued into the second stanza, and we've got this situation where the farmer goes looking for her. But what's interesting about it, to me anyway, is the use of the word we, the pronoun we. We chased her, almost like everybody in the village kind of supports him. Nowadays, if you married a girl and, she didn't want to marry you, but you forced her to marry you, and then she ran away, desperately trying to get freedom, you wouldn't be able to knock on your neighbour's door and go, oh, she's run away again, let's go out and find her and drag her back, because forced marriage is obviously seen as something that's terrible and that denies people their human rights and their freedoms. So that use of the word we really kind of points to the lack of rights that women had during that time, particularly the lack of rights that a married woman had, and the lack of sympathy she got within the community. And let's just take a look at some of this imagery. So we chased her, flying like a hare before out lanterns. So they chased her in the dark. They had lanterns. She ran away at night, probably when she thought she could escape and hide. And we've got the simile of her flying like a hare. A hare is a creature that's a bit like a rabbit but a bit bigger. So it's a frightened, vulnerable animal, if you think about it like that. And I think there's this real sense in this line here, or in these two lines, that they're not just trying to find her, they're hunting her. She's being hunted like an animal. So I'm going to go down to my table that I've made, and if you watch my videos, you're going to know that I like my tables. And I've made a table, and what I want to do in this table is I want to look at some of the issues of power and control in the poem. And I've done one column that says the farmer, and I've done one column that says the bride, and I would encourage you to do the same. And in one column, we're going to put evidence that the farmer has control over this woman and power over this woman. And in the next column, we're going to put evidence that the bride is weak, vulnerable, etc. So what I'm going to add to that is has the power, if you like, and I'm going to put the bride vulnerable. So first of all, we've got ownership in the title, and we've got owned. in the title. Hunts his bride, and you can put the quote here, "We chased her." And for this one, I'm going to put simile or even smile, comparing her to a hare, a vulnerable hunted animal. So, just doing this table, we're just starting to get some ideas. You can go and pull out quotes and back this up with quotes, and when you're writing about this poem, if you had a question about perhaps the balance of power within the relationship or anything like that, or the relationship between men and women in the poems, you could start to look at this table. And I'm going to do a comparison video with this poem, Porphyria's Lover and Sing Song, because I think that the three of them really sit nicely together. I'm going to do a comparison video, but in the meantime, you can just get notes about this down, and you can start to think about the relationship between these two, the balance of power, the way in which the man is portrayed, as opposed to the woman. And there's more than this. Do you know what I mean? This isn't everything that you're going to get out of this poem. I'm just giving you some stuff to get you started. So if you're looking at it and you think, he's missed something, he probably has missed something. Go ahead, put your own things in. This is just to give you some ideas. So let's go back to our poem. They chased her at night. And I just want to kind of look at this line, her wide brown stare. He says that they went looking for her, and she wasn't there. She wasn't in her bed, lying awake with her wide brown stare. There's a suggestion, I think, here that the farmer is quite fixated with this woman. He finds her very attractive. You've got this imagery of her wide brown stare, her big brown eyes. So there is this suggestion that he really finds this woman attractive, and almost I think the suggestion that perhaps he sat and stared at her when she's in bed, and really taken her in. He's got a good picture of her in his mind. It's quite a sinister poem. They chased her over 7 acres, up, along and across the down, flying like a hare before out the lanterns, to church town, all in a shiver and a scare. We caught her. Look at that verb, we caught her. Really, really kind of adds to the sense that she's hunted. To catch something is like, you catch something. It's pretty sinister. Fetched her home, so they brought her back to his house at last. And it's not just I caught her, we caught her. You imagine how terrified this woman was. She's being hunted by perhaps 10 men, big rural working men that work on the land. This is set in a rural community, and she flees one night because she just does not love this man. She's frightened, she's vulnerable. They chase her across the fields, they catch her, they physically drag her back to the house, and then they turn the key upon her fast. They lock her in a room. I just want to draw your attention to the line here. So over 7 acre field and up across the down, we chased her, flying like a hare before out the lanterns. There's a lot of syllables, so over 7 acre field and up at long across the down. That sense of lots of syllables kind of gives it that, to me anyway, almost that feeling of like footsteps, people running like horses' hooves, almost like the feel of the chase. You've got lots of syllables, you've got the connective, and it makes it quite an exciting sort of line. It's quite an exciting thing for them. They're chasing her, they're catching her. It's also a fairly long, it's quite long before we get a full stop, which kind of gives it that kind of breathless feel perhaps, compared to some of the other lines where we've got a lot of punctuation. We've got the comma, the semicolon, and then we've got the full stop, and then we get this longer sentence. So you might sort of comment on that a little bit as well. Going to the third stanza, they've caught her now, and we've gone into the present tense. She does the work about the house. Up until that point, we're in the past tense, so we're kind of in the present now, and we don't really find out what's happening in between times, but we can guess, since the day quarter, that their relationship hasn't got any better, because we know from the title that they haven't consummated the marriage. If we infer that from the title, which that's personally what I infer. She does the work about the house. Bear in mind, this is written at a time when a woman was kind of a man's property. Men and women got married. Women didn't go out to work. They raised children. They did the housework. So essentially, she does as she's told. She's not a bad wife. She does the work about the house as well as most. So in that respect, she's doing what she's supposed to. But like a mouse, happy enough to chat and play with birds and rabbits, as they say, so long as menfolk keep away. And we've got this simile again, comparing her to a mouse, comparing her to a small, kind of vulnerable creature. So I'm going to quickly go back down to our table. Let's say in here, we can say locks her up. Suggests that he has a lot of power over her. And in here, we can say compared to a mouse, and again that's a simile if you're thinking about the language devices. And again, there's more stuff than this. I'm just throwing some stuff in. It's fairly straightforward, this poem is. Once you get past the language, the phonetic language, and you really kind of get your head into it, it's not a difficult poem to write about, I don't think. She does the work about the house as well as most, but like a mouse, happy enough to chat and play with birds and rabbits, and such as they, so long as menfolk keep away. So almost like she stops communicating with people altogether. She's so traumatized by this marriage that she's actually got to a stage where she's not communicating with people anymore. She becomes completely isolated, and she starts to communicate with animals. There's a sense here of her being very, very, very withdrawn, and I think there's a sense of perhaps some sort of mental breakdown, mental illness. She's not communicating with anybody. Interestingly, the writer of the poet Charlotte Mew, suffered from mental illness, so that's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about the context of this poem. And of course, it's hardly surprising that she begins to associate more with animals than she does with people, because after all, she's treated like an animal in this poem. She's denied her human rights, and I think the poet makes an important point here about how women were treated, particularly in a marriage. And she's scared of men. So long as menfolk keep away, she's happy as long as men stay away from her. So this is an experience that's frightened her of men. Not near, not near, this is what she's saying, or this is what her eyes are saying whenever anybody comes near. Not near, her eyes beseech, when one of us comes within reach. And I think this is interesting, us. Again, he associates himself with the other men in this community. We, us, to me, really points to the division at this time between men and women. Men and women at this time probably didn't have that much to do with each other. Men and women wouldn't socialise necessarily. A man wouldn't go down the pub with a woman after he'd finished his work, like perhaps nowadays happens. Men would work all day. Women would stay at home. They'd raise the children. They'd clean, etc., etc. And probably the men would communicate with each other, and really the only time that men and women probably would communicate in a lot of relationships would be in the bedroom. That was where men and women came together, and of course that's not happening in this poem. So we've got this sense of him just really being at a loss as to what to do with her in this poem, because she's not fulfilling her role as he sees it. And then he's got, the women say that beasts in stall look round like children at her call. So the women in the village are telling him that whenever she talks, the animals actually kind of look round, and it's almost like she can communicate with the animals. But what's interesting is that he says the women say, almost like he's consulted the other women in the area about this. What do you think I should do about this? Almost like he really has absolutely no understanding of his bride whatsoever. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand her. And I'm going to come back to the idea of this is a speaker with no emotional intelligence at all. You can compare him to the speaker in Porphyria's Lover in that he has a lot of power over the female in the poem. But I don't think he has the intelligence of the speaker in Porphyria's Lover. And this is a sinister poem, but I don't think it's sinister in the same way. Porphyria's Lover, the man in the poem, understands what he's doing. Although he is deluded, I think he understands what he's doing. Whereas I don't think this guy does. I just don't think he has any kind of concept of her having rights and her being a person. He just doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand why she doesn't love him. And then he says, but I've hardly heard her speak at all, and that's not surprising considering he's he's got such a terrible relationship with her. Yeah, just quickly to go back to this this second stanza as well. The idea of her running to church town could refer to the idea that perhaps she went to the church because she wanted to divorce him, and that's where a woman would have gone to get a divorce. In those days, women didn't tend to divorce men. It wasn't like today where people just fall out of love and they get a divorce. Once you're married for life. But it's possible she did go to church to get a divorce, or it's possible that she went to church just to pray because she didn't really know what else to do, or perhaps she went to church because she thought she'd be safe in the church. She thought that was the only place that she could hide from him, or where she might get some sort of protection. God might give her protection or whatever. But it's worth thinking about. Coming to the fourth stanza, we've got another simile, shy as a leveret. Another simile that compares her to a small animal. A leveret is it's a bit like a rabbit or a hare. So again, she's being compared to an animal. And think about this guy for a moment who's narrating this poem, who's speaking. He's a farmer. So the natural imagery in the poem makes sense. It makes sense that he would imbue the poem with natural imagery, because that's the world that he's part of. That's the world that he lives in. Also, to come back to this this stanza here as well, of her chatting and playing with the animals, it also paints a very innocent picture. Somebody who's very childish again, which again links to the idea of her being too young. But yeah, we've got the simile shy as a leveret, swift as he. So she's shy as a leveret, and she's swift. She's fast as well. Straight and slight as a young larch tree. So he compares her to a young tree. And again, that imagery of somebody who's young and perhaps beginning to blossom, but isn't there yet. That idea of somebody who's still kind of only just about a woman. Sweet as the first wild violet, she to her wild self, but what to me? So in this stanza, he talks about how beautiful she is, and he does it using lots of similes. And they're all similes which belong to the natural world. And it's quite romantic language, comparing her to, a young tree, a flower. He compares her to a wild violet. The word wild might suggest that she's untamed as well. And we've got that repetition of the word wild as well, the poet using repetition to emphasise that idea that she's becoming more and more withdrawn from human contact. She's wild. But, quite romantic language comparing her to a flower. But then at the end of the stanza he says, but what do I get? What does she give me? She doesn't give me anything. So there's this sense in the poem that this is a guy who is still very much in love with her. He still finds her very, very attractive, and he wants her. And it's quite sinister, because that sense of sexual tension is very strong in this poem. This is a guy who wants this woman. And you have to ask yourself, how long is he gonna restrain himself? She's been in his house, on his property, for 3 years. She hasn't had sex with him. He still wants her. He wants to have sex with her. How long is he gonna restrain himself? And I think that there's this idea through the poem, to me anyway, of that sexual tension. And I also think that question, but what to me, can really be translated as, why isn't she giving me sex? Why isn't she giving me what I want? Why isn't she being a proper wife and being tender with me? She cleans up around the house. She's good around the house, as I've already said, but she's not giving me what I want in other ways. So there's also that complete lack of understanding or sympathy and selfishness. What to me? He's not interested in her at all. In the following stanza, the penultimate stanza, we've got these lines the short days shorten and the oaks are brown. So we've got another reference to the seasons. We've got this motif. We've got a reference to the idea of the nights drawing in and the winter coming. And winter tends to, again in poetry, represent the end of something. It represents coldness, hardness. Perhaps at this point, the speaker is really beginning to accept that this is not a marriage that is ever going to work. And we've got lots of imagery, and it's kind of quite depressing, dark imagery. The short days shorten and the oaks are brown. The blue smoke rises to the low grey sky. One leaf in the still air falls slowly down. A magpie's spotted feathers lie on the black earth spread white with rime. The berries redden up to Christmas time. So there's that movement there. And we almost get this passage of time through the winter, or through the beginning of the winter up until Christmas time. The berries redden up. Again, we've got that image of something ripening, something coming to fruition. But we've also got some imagery here, a magpie's spotted feather. Magpies often are associated with bad luck, one for sorrow. So you might think about that. And there's lots of dull colours here, brown, grey, black, blue. We've got the imagery of things beginning to die. One leaf in the air falls slowly down, which would suggest perhaps links to that idea that he's beginning to accept and understand that this marriage is not going to work. And then, it's Christmas time, and we know that we associate Christmas time with happiness, being together, being with the family. And of course, this guy doesn't have a family. I don't want to make you feel sorry for him in this poem, because I don't think you should feel sorry for him. I think the sympathy is very much with the woman, but I think he's feeling sorry for himself at this point. And then he says, "What's Christmas time without there be some other in the house than we?" And this is an interesting line, because he's saying, well, what's the point of Christmas if it's just me and her in the house? And I think what he's saying there is, I want children. And then in this line, we learn that their relationship is even frostier. And it's really reached a kind of a stalemate now. She sleeps up in the attic there, alone, poor maid. And we've got that repetition again here of the word maid, which again links to the idea that this is not a marriage. They are not man and wife. He's not even referring to her as a bride here. He's referring to her as a maid, as he did in the opening stanza. And I think the idea as well of the stairs separating the attic from the rest of the house really kind of become a metaphor for that division between them. And he says, "'Tis but a stair betwixt us." So it's but a flight of stairs. There's nothing but a flight of stairs between us. And I like this line because I think it really shows his complete misreading and misunderstanding of the situation. It's only a stair. It's only a flight of stairs that comes between us. There's more than stairs between them. This is a woman or a girl who has never loved him and never will love him. So his idea that it's only a flight of stairs that separate them is really, really completely misreading the situation. It's not just about the physical separation. They're on completely different planes, and it really shows the speaker's lack of emotional intelligence, which for me is something that comes through very strongly in this poem. And then we've got these lines at the end with this kind of exclamation marks. Oh my God, and almost, you know what? It's almost, I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to say it. It's almost orgasmic. Like, he's really overcome with lust for this woman. I think there's a lot of sexual tension in this poem, and he's thinking about her when he says this. Oh my God, the soft young down of her, the brown of her eyes, her hair. And again, it mentions those brown eyes, and he mentioned the brown eyes earlier on in the poem. So there's real suggestion in this poem, and in these lines in particular, that he really, really wants her. Now, this is how the poem ends. I think it's quite a sinister ending to the poem, because if you think about it, there's only a stair, and he's already said this, There's only a flight of stairs between us. She's up there in the attic. I want her. And there's only these stairs separating us. There's that sense that it's only so long before he rapes her. And I know that's a dark thing to say, but for me, it's there on the page. He's already compared her to a small, weak, vulnerable animal. He's come to accept the fact that she will never give herself to him voluntarily. He's hunted her. He's already been out and he's caught her and he's brought her back and he's locked her in the house. And now she lives up in the attic and he wants her and he thinks about her all the time and he's fixated on her and he wants a child and he's thinking, and all that's between us is a flight of stairs. 'Tis but a stair betwixt us. So I think this is quite a sinister ending to the poem. So to come back to our table, we've got this idea that she is up in the attic, which almost suggests that she is imprisoned. And certainly it suggests that she's isolated. And I think you can put isolated, and I think you can put not talks, because I don't think she really talks. She's not Dr. Dolittle, but she communicates with the animals. So that idea of her being isolated, imprisoned, which all links back to her kind of being vulnerable. And then you've got this idea of him kind of at the end of the poem, thinking about the stairs that separate them. And I'm going to put almost as if there's really very little between them. Sorry. Which kind of suggests to me that it's only a matter of time before he takes what he believes is his, because she is his wife, and ultimately he can do as he pleases. And we know he can do as he pleases because he's already caught her and brought her back and locked her in the house. So this isn't a woman that he's going to give any rights to. The rhyme scheme, just to one last thing, the rhyme scheme in the poem, you'll notice, it veers around quite a bit. You've got, made, do, woo, afraid, human, day, woman, fey, away. It's all over the place. It breaks in and out of rhyming couplets. And I don't know, there's lots of different ways that you could interpret this and you could read into it. If I was going to talk about the structure of the poem, the rhyme in the poem, I would certainly hone in on these lines where we've got this idea of them chasing her. So over 7 acre field and up along across the down. Dun 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 dun. You got that feeling of a chase, of people, running across the fields, the hard, fast footsteps. I'd talk about that. But if I was going to talk about the rhyme scheme, I would talk about the way that it contains some rhyming couplets and then it breaks in and out of some of the rhyming couplets. For me, the rhyming couplets and the kind of sparse use of the rhyming couplets and the way that the rhyme scheme kind of moves around and meanders, it's worth looking at it, comparing it with Porphyria's Lover, because the rhyme scheme in Porphyria's Lover is very strict, very kind of controlled and metered, and you get that sense of intense control that the speaker in that poem has by the end of it and desires throughout the poem. But the speaker in this poem doesn't have that level of control. He controls this woman physically, but he doesn't control her mind. She never gives him what he wants. In fact, in some ways, he doesn't control her physically because she hasn't had sex with him. But also, she's not in love with him. This love is completely unrequited. If he does love her, he desires her, whether he loves her or not. He doesn't love her really because he's not interested in how she feels about him. If he loved her, he would understand. But certainly he wants her. But that feeling is unreciprocated. So to me, he doesn't have the control that's represented by the rhyme scheme in Porphyria's Lover that speaker has over the woman. But he does have a certain amount of control. So you've got this rhyme scheme, and you get those rhyming couplets occasionally, but they're not in there all the time. Do you know what I mean? So you've got this kind of more of a random rhyme scheme, if you like. you know, you can interpret this however you want, but I just think it's worth being aware of the rhyme scheme. So that's it. You've got plenty to go on with there. You know, you've got this table, and I haven't put a lot in this table, to be fair. I've left it fairly sparse. I would suggest, you know, if you want to get to grips with this poem, that you go through this poem and you add to this table. And I would also suggest that you pick out some quotes and put them in there as well. I'm going to be doing a video that compares this poem with Porphyria's Lover and with Sing Song. So if you're interested in writing about this poem and comparing this poem to some of the other poems in the Love and Relationships cluster, then I would definitely check that video out. But in the meantime, you know, go through it again, pull out some more things. I've given you a start there, but there's plenty more to be getting on with. So yeah, good luck with it.